Now this tutorial isn't so much about making the bag, it's about fitting the letterbox zip at the back, which is what you asked me to do, so that's what I'm going to show you. I call it a letterbox zip. I'm sure there's a proper name for it, but that's what I call it because it looks like a letterbox or a post box, and you post your fabric through it. You'll see that in the demonstration later on. But basically you end up with a very neat pocket, which is, when you open it, fully lined as well, and it's really easy to do. So I've just put one zip pocket onto the back of this bag, and I think that's a nice idea for security, because whether you're wearing this as a crossbody bag or a shoulder bag, the zip pocket is against your body. But you could add more if you wanted to. So I've put a patch pocket on the inside of this bag. You could have put another letterbox zip there. You could have a letterbox zip in the flap. You could have a letterbox zip across the front of this. So I've just made the one. You can add as many of those as you want to whatever kind of bag that you're making. The fabric that I've used here is a canvas. So it's quite sturdy, but I've also added some fusible fleece to the inside as well. I've used a cotton webbing for the strap. You could make that from the same fabric or the lining fabric if you wanted to coordinate it. And for my lining, I've used a matching poplin fabric for that one. So okay, then the first thing we're going to do is to get making up that zip. I'll show you how easy this is, and then we'll complete the rest of the bag. So I have two outer pieces, two lining pieces cut to the same size, and these have a 1.5 inch box cut from each bottom corner, and with the outer pieces I've fused an H630 fusible fleece to the wrong size. Although I'm using canvas, the H630 makes that a really strong and durable bag. For the flap, I've got my smaller piece of outer fabric fused with fleece and a lining fabric cut to the same size. Two pieces of the outer fabric without fleece this time for my patch pocket on the inside, and there's my letterbox zip pocket lining, plus my webbing for the strap, a magnetic snap. I'm using an 18mm, 14mm would be fine, and I've got my regular zip that I'm going to use for the zip pocket. So let's construct this first of all. So I'm going to take the back section of my bag and the pocket lining piece. Now when this is fitted, it's actually going to be folded over like so. So that will be the size of my finished pocket. So I'm going to line this up so that it is centrally, and that would be 1.5 inches from each side, and then about 3/4 of an inch from the top. And I'll need my larger ruler. I'm just going to pin this in place, and then draw a rectangle onto this lining side of the fabric through which I'm going to actually fit the zip. So I'm going to measure 1.5 inches. This is the top, so 1.5 inches from the top of that pocket and 1 inch in. Like so, and then we'll make that into a 1/2 inch rectangular square, like so. That's 12mm if you are metric. So that's where my zip's going to sit. I'm also going to draw a line straight down the centre of that box, and then into a V shape at each end. So that's where my zip is going to sit. Then I'll need to sew all the way around the outside of that box using a small stitch on my sewing machine. So I'm using a 2.2 on this machine. So be very careful with this, because this is going to form the shape of the opening that your zip is going to sit inside. So you want to make sure that your corners are nice and pointy by leaving the needle in the down position while you pivot around, and that your sewing lines are really straight and accurate. Put your iron on at this point as well. We're going to iron this in just a second. Back down, whoops, one more stitch. Back down into the corner, and down to where I started stitching. And then you'll need a very sharp pair of scissors to make a snip into the centre. You can probably hear my dog walking around the studio. Hey Bob, hey. And then cut straight down the centre of the line that you've just drawn. When you come to the Y shape, you're going to snip into the corners. So as accurately as you can, right up to that stitch line, but not into the stitches. The closer you can get right into the corner, the better. And the same on these two sides. So right into that corner. And then take your pins out. Bring the ironing pad up. And then this is why I call it a letterbox zip or a post box zip, because this looks like a post box, and we're going to take this lining fabric and post it through the hole. And then we're going to take a little bit of time just pulling all of that fabric through to make that square neat. Now I find it easier to do from the lining side, so I'm going to pull the fabric back so that the seam is right on the edge, and we'll give that a press. And the same on this side, and give that a press. Oops, Poppy. So I have my dog underneath the table here. Hi, sweetie. And she's just trodden on the foot pedal of my sewing machine. So it's a kind of a ghostly encounter when your machine starts sewing all of a sudden and you're not actually sewing. But that's what happened. Okay, now try and pull this out of the corner as best as you can. And I find when I do this from the lining side, if you're going to get a wrinkle, you tend to get it in the lining, which is fine because that's not going to be seen. But just keep pulling this out. Let's turn it over and see how we're looking from here. That's the most important bit. So I've got no wrinkles on the bit that you're going to see. I do, however, have a few wrinkles in the corner here. So I can persevere a little while, just trying that as flat as I can. But to be honest, I'm not too worried about that. You're never going to see it. Okay, so there's my opening. Then we're going to put our zip behind the opening. Mine's, as usual, always too long. So I'm going to cut it down to size just a little bit for now. And this is going to sit facing downwards over the back of the hole here. I like to use a glue stick to hold this in place. You could pin and then hand tack or baste. I wouldn't just use pins on their own when I sew a zip in, because I tend to find that the zip moves a bit as you're trying to maneuver around the pins. So my preference is to use a glue stick. Meant for fabric, will wash out, won't end up blue. I'm going to open the zip a little bit and then place this facing down over the gap. Make sure the end of the zip is together here. And the nice thing with using the glue is, while I'm just waiting for that to set, I can now double check from the right side that my zip is sitting exactly in the centre of this hole. So everything is kept nice and square. And then I'm going to sew all the way around the edge of this box. So I can put my stitch length back up to normal. I'm not using a zipper foot on my sewing machine. I can, if I want to, move the needle across to the left hand side slightly. If you have a digital sewing machine, then that's an option for you. And I'm just very carefully going to sew all around the outside of that box. And you can, if you want, extend or lengthen your stitch a little bit as you sew around. And again, try and keep this nice and neat and straight. This is going to be visible on the outside of the bag, so that's quite important. When I'm approaching the slider here, I'm going to leave the needle in the down position, lift the foot up. Some machines have an extra high presser foot lift, which helps. Let's take the zip slider and just move that out of the way of the zip, of the seam, sorry, and then carry on sewing. So again, stop with the needle down at the end, Just making sure the ends of the zip are meeting, and then carry on sewing all the way around. It's quite nice if you're a confident top stitcher to do this in a contrasting fabric. So a mustard colour would work well with my fabric here. If you're not so confident, then use a similar colour thread, grey, beige or cream, and then the stitches don't stand out so much. And back down to where I started. And we'll just cut away that loose thread. Oh, and you. So from the back you can see now that my zip is too long, so I can cut that down again, and the ends of the zip here can be chopped off. And then the bottom part of the pocket I'm going to lift up to the top, and I can sew around these three sides, but I don't want to sew through the outside of the bag. So I'm going to move that out of the way and pop a pin in there just to hold it back. So again, with this side I only want to sew through the lining, not through the outer bag. So fold it out of the way and pin it, and the same with the top, right away from that lining fabric, and pin it out of the way. And then again, sew around these three sides, no turning up needed or anything like that. Just sew around the three sides of the lining. And then let's take out the pins. So there's my zip finished from, this will be the outside of the bag, nicely lined on the inside of the bag, but with no stitching seen where the pocket is here. And of course that will remain kind of inside out. That will be in between the outer and the lining piece of the bag, so you're not going to see that section. So that bit's now finished. So let's make up the rest of the bag. So we'll do the flap piece next. So take my pieces, there we go. And I'd like this to be slightly rounded at the bottom. So I'm going to take a circle template, I'm just using a ribbon reel here, and draw. Now I'm using a biro, two reasons, so that you can see what I'm doing, and secondly, it's within the seam allowance, so you're not going to see that. If it was a mark that is going to be seen, then I would use an erasable marking tool. So let's cut that round. I'm cutting through the lining and the outer section here. Then we'll fit the slimmer half of the magnetic snap to the lining side. So let's fold this in half and crease to find the centre. I'm going to take the backing section of my snap and put this about 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres from the edge here, and draw a little line into each side of the snap. Now if your fabric's quite fine, you could put a backing piece behind this to strengthen it. I don't need to with this one, it's quite a strong cotton. So then you can take your quick and pick or a very sharp pair of scissors and just cut a little snip into those lines that you've just drawn. Then take the slimmer part, pop that through those two marks, whoops, and to the back. Now this is where I would normally have used an erasable pen, but again I just wanted to use a pen where you can see exactly what I'm doing. So let's push those prongs through, and then the back of the snap goes on, and you'll probably find it easier to squish the prongs open than you do towards you. Then we'll sew the two sections of the flap right sides together, just around the bottom three sides. So I'll just hold that in place with a couple of pins. And seam allowance wise, I'm just using the edge of my presser foot. So it's just over 1/4 inch, maybe about 7 millimeters. So take your time as you're going around the curve. This again will form the shape of your flap, so we want that to be nice and smooth without any jagged or straight lines. Just got the snap caught on the throat plate, so do be aware of that. Again, around that curve, nice and smooth, and back to the beginning. And then I'm going to just snip around the curves. If you have pinking shears, that would work well, but I'm just trimming the seam allowance of the curved section back to reduce the bulk in the seam on the curved section. Let's take out the pins, turn the right side out, push out those corners neatly, and we'll press it. And then I'll lengthen the stitch on my sewing machine and we'll top stitch all around the edge. So this time we'll go up to a 2.8 on this machine and stitch. And again, if you're using a contrast thread around the zip opening, then the contrast thread around here would look quite nice as well. So nice and smoothly around the curves. And back to the beginning. And top stitching not only looks nice, gives you a shop bought look, but it also helps to keep the flap pieces nice and straight and together. This is going to go to the back of my my bag. So remember, I've got the zip at the back of this one. So right sides together, and we'll position this centrally. You can measure to make sure that those are equidistant if you wish. I'm going to hold that with a couple of clips here. And we'll sew straight across the top here, just within the seam allowance, just to hold that in place. So quite close to the edge. And I can keep my long stitch for this one as well. So let's put that to one side for a second while we fit the magnetic snap to the front of the bag. Now actually at this point we can gauge exactly where that's going to sit. So I've put the front together with the back. Let's flip this over, and we don't want this too tight because remember we're going to have a little bit of a gusset around here. So I would leave this 3/4 inch each side here, so it's not really snug and tight over the top. And then I will use an erasable marker pen for this one. I'm going to lift up where I see the snap is and put a mark on this side, and then measure that just to make sure that that is sitting centrally and that is absolutely spot on. Then just like before, we'll take the back of the snap and sit that over that central hole. Put a mark each side. Take your quick and pick or a sharp pair of scissors and make a small incision both through the fabric and through the interfacing. Don't make the hole too big. You can always make a big hole, a small hole bigger. If your hole is too big, then you've got a repair job to do. So let's fit the prongs through the holes and take that backing, which seems to have rolled away from me, and fit that over the back, and like before we push those prongs open. So those are the outer sections finished for now. We're going to put the patch pocket onto one side of the lining. If you wanted to repeat the letterbox zip technique, then just do exactly the same as you did on the outer bag, but this time on the lining. My patch pocket is going to go in the centre here. So I'll take my 2 fabric pieces, right sides together, and I'm going to sew all the way around but leave a turning up in the bottom of around about 2 or 3 inches, quite a small one. And then I'll snip off the corners just like before to cut down on bulk. And turn the whole thing the right side out. If you have a point turner or a turning tool or a knitting needle or something to poke out of the corners would help. Let's just pull those through. If you don't have anything to hand that's pointy like that, then a blunt pencil, the end of a pen, just something to poke all of those corners out, and then we'll press it. And then just top stitch across the top side. I'm not going to sew the turning up closed in the bottom because that's going to be sewn closed when we sew this into the bag. So I'll just turn the ends of the seam in to make that neat and just give it a press. And then just top stitch straight across that top side. Then take the pocket and the lining section and place this in the centre. I've just got a few loose threads that have appeared here for some reason. Snip those off to make it neat. And again, this needs to sit centrally, so the same distance from each side. You could measure that to make sure if you wish. That's pretty good. Then I'm going to sit this 2 inches from the top. Again, I'm just making sure that that's sitting centrally. And we'll sew it. So it's up to you now if you wanted one large pocket, or you could put a dividing line down the centre if you wanted to make that into 2 smaller pockets. That's up to you. I'll just go for one larger pocket here. So I'm just going to make sure when I start sewing that I reverse stitch to, there we go, just to strengthen that seam somewhat. Down into the corner. I'm stitching quite close to the edge of the pocket here as well. The closer to the edge you stitch, the more pocket room you actually have. And I've just closed over the opening at the bottom of the pocket as I sewed over it just then. So back up to the final side here, and again reverse stitch to strengthen that seam. Then I can take out the pins and we'll start to put the bag together. So let's take the 2 lining pieces first of all, as I have them here, and I'm going to match them up together and sew all the way around. I'm not going to sew over the corners. I'm going to sew the bottom, the side, and then this side I'm going to leave a turning up big enough to get my hand inside. So you can pin these together if you wish. I'm not going to this time. So again, down to the corner and stop, straight across the bottom, and then the final side with my turning gap. And then I'm going to make the bag base square by, just got a thread there, pulling open that cutout corner so that the base seam is sitting over the side seam, and we'll sew straight across here. I'm not worried about pressing seams open or in which direction they go, but when I come to the second side here and I pull this open, I'm just going to push the seam in the same direction as it is on that side, and again just sew straight across the edge to make the base square. And then we're going to repeat this with the outer section of the bag. So again, take your two pieces, they're right sides together, and this time no turning up, we're going to sew here, here and here, and then make the base square as I just did with the lining. Then take your webbing for your strap, and I'm just going to sew this facing downwards to the side of the bag. So right over the side seam here, and just sew again within the seam allowance just across the top. And then making sure your strap isn't twisted, we're going to wrap this around and come back to the opposite side and sew this across the top of the opposite seam here. You can use the free arm in your sewing machine if you wish. So you can actually see what the bag's going to look like now. But of course we need to put the lining inside, so let's turn the flap over. And we're going to drop the whole of the outer bag inside the lining with the right sides together. So my outer bag is the right side out, my lining is inside out, and I want my pocket to be on the back. So let's slip this inside here. This time I am going to use the free arm on my sewing machine, so I'll just remove the accessory compartment. Make sure that the strap and the flap are facing downwards, and then line up the side seams of the outer bag and the lining. And again, if you want to pin that, then do feel free. And then we're simply going to sew all the way around the top. So let's slip this over the free arm and sew in a circle. The whole bag is now going to be turned through the turning gap in the side, like so. And the gap I have in the side of my lining now I'm going to sew closed. So if you pull each side of the gap away from each other, the edge of the seam allowance folds in, and I can simply sew straight over the top of that hole. If you wanted that to be invisible, not noticed, then either make sure you use the same colour thread as your lining fabric, or you could hand sew with a ladder stitch if you prefer. Right, so then we'll push the lining inside the bag. Push out the corners. And I'm just going to press this again before I top stitch all around the top. So I'm pulling the lining away from the seam. And the same on the front. You find it easier, I think, to iron from the inside like this. So just pull the lining inwards and press the seam right on the edge. And then finally just over the sides here where the handles are. and just over this side. And then finally I will top stitch all the way around the edge to help to keep the lining in place and keep the seam nice and neat on the top there. Just move the flap out, that's it. So longer stitch again, I can go up to my 2.8 again. I like to start and stop over the side seam so it's not so noticeable where the stitches join. And again, I'm just going to keep pulling the lining away from the seam and carefully top stitch all the way around. And there's my bag finished, so you may need to give that a final press. Just tuck that lining back inside. And just push out those corners again. So that folds over and fastens perfectly neatly in the centre. And there on the back is that letterbox style zip. And as I said before, if you wanted to add another one of those zips into the lining instead of the patch pocket, that would work well. You could add another zip pocket to the outside of the front if you wish, and that again is going to be very secure because it fastens underneath the flap. So I hope you enjoyed that. Letterbox zips are so easy, but I think for bag mating particularly, they look really effective and really professional as well. So I'm sure you're going to be adding these to a lot of the bags that you make now. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. I'll see you again next time. Bye bye.